Welcome to Data Engineering Studies. In this Azure Real-Time Scenarios playlist, we are going to see an interesting Azure use case. The scenario is, in a raw container, inside the main folder manager, there are some txt files and several subfolders like employee1, employee2, employee3, etc. Inside the subfolder, there are several txt files. Here is the folder structure of our storage account. Inside our raw container, we have a main folder called manager. Inside the manager folder, there are several subfolders and some txt files. If you see a subfolder, for example, employee1 has several txt files. Similarly, the other subfolders like employee2 and employee3 also has several txt files. The scope of this use case is move the files from main folder and the subfolder to a different container called curated using Azure Pipeline. Here is the diagrammatic representation of the use case. Here is the raw container, and from the raw container we are taking all the txt files and moving it to the curated container. We have to move the files from the master folder and the subfolders and move the files to the curated container. I hope the scope of this use case is clear. Now let's see some of the challenges of this use case. To read the files from the main folder, we are using forEach activity. However, to read the files inside the subfolder, we need to use another forEach activity. Unfortunately, nested forEach activity is not supported in Azure Data Factory. But the good news is we have a workaround for this use case. We can use an execute pipeline activity inside a forEach activity to iterate over the subfolders and to read the subfolder files. We are going to see the detailed step-by-step implementation of this pipeline. First, let's see some of the prerequisites of this use case. We need to have the storage account created, the files uploaded in the source container. In order to create the pipeline, we need Azure Data Factory resource. Here is my Azure homepage. For this use case, I am going to use the storage account. Inside that, let me go to the container. I have two containers, raw and curated. In the raw container, I have the folder manager. Inside manager folder, I have two files, manager detail and manager salary. And I also have three subfolders, employee1, employee2 and employee3. Inside employee2, I have employee detail and employee salary files. Similarly, inside employee2, I have employee2 details and employee2 salary txt files. Let me go to employee3 folder. Inside employee3 folder, I have employee3 details.txt and employee3.txt. The objective of this use case is to copy these files and load into the curated container. Currently, the curated container is empty. The first step is to create a child pipeline with a parameter to pass the subfolder name. Let's implement that. In order to create the child pipeline, let me go to Azure Data Factory. Let me go to author, and inside pipeline, I am going to create a new pipeline. Let me name my pipeline as PL child. PL child. For this child pipeline, we need to pass the subfolder name as parameter. What I mean is, if you go to the storage account and inside the manager, we have the subfolders. This child pipeline is to iterate over these subfolders and copy these files to the curated container. Let me go to Azure Data Factory. As a first step, I am going to create a pipeline parameter. For this pipeline parameter, I am going to pass the folder name. Let me name my parameter as folder name. In order to read the subfolder names, I am going to add a get metadata activity. Get metadata activity. Let me go to the settings and create a new data set. I have the files in Azure Blob Storage and click continue. Let me select binary. I have selected binary in order to iterate over the txt files. Let me name my data set as ds child. ds child source. And I am going to create a linked service for the storage account. New. I am going to name my linked service as ls blob storage. Let me select my Azure subscription and my storage account name. Let me test my connection. The connection is successful. Now let me create. I'm going to select the source file path. It is in raw inside the manager folder. We have to iterate over these subfolders. For now, I'm not going to select any folder name. Let me click OK and click OK. We have created the data set. Inside the field list, I'm going to select the argument as child items in order to read the file names. Let me go to the data set again. We have to pass the subfolder name from pipeline parameters. For that, I am going to create a parameter as folder name. In the file path, I am going to change this by adding a dynamic content. The folder name is a concatenation of manager and the subfolder name. Concat manager, which is my main folder, slash the dataset parameter. Let me select the folder name. Now let me go to the child pipeline. The folder name for this data set should come from the pipeline parameter. Let me select the pipeline parameter. Let me click OK. Let's publish till this point and run the pipeline once. Let me click publish. The pipeline is successfully published. Let me run my pipeline. For this folder name, I am going to select the employee1 folder. Let me pass employee1. Let me click OK. If you view the pipeline execution, there is a typo in the manager. Let me correct that. Let me go to the data set. Let me correct this as manager. Now let me click OK and publish this pipeline again. Now let me run this pipeline. I'm going to pass as employee1. Let me go to pipeline execution. Let me click refresh. If you go to the output of the get metadata activity, inside the child items, we are having a list of all the file names. Why I am saying that as a list is because we have a square bracket. Inside the list, we have a dictionary which has the name and the corresponding file and type with the value as file. Similarly, we have the second file as employee salary. The next step is to iterate over these file names. For this, I am going to add a forEach activity. Let me go to the pipeline again, and I am going to add a forEach activity. Let me connect the get metadata activity with the forEach activity. Inside the forEach activity settings, we are going to select the get metadata activity child items. Why we are selecting this? In order to read the file names, we have to select get metadata activity child items. Inside the forEach activity, we can directly use a copy data activity to copy the files from the raw container to the curated container. Now let me mention the source and the sync setting for the copy data activity. Let me go to source. For the source, I can use the same data set that I used in the get metadata activity, ds child source. These subfolder names should come from forEach activity. Let me select forEach activity. Inside that, we saw the file names in the key as name. Now let me click OK. In order to read all the txt files, I am going to use wildcard file path, and my folder path is a concatenation of manager folder slash the subfolder name that we get from the pipeline parameter. Let me select parameter and select the subfolder name. Let me click OK. We have all the files as txt files. In the wildcard file name, I am going to select star.txt. Now let me go to the sync settings. Let me create a sync data set. The sync data set is also Azure Blob Storage. Let me click continue. The files are txt files, so I am selecting binary and click continue. I am going to name my data set as ds target. ds target. Let me select the linked service. I can have the same linked service because we are using the same blob storage. Let me select the folder path as curated. Let me click OK. OK again. Our source and the sync settings are completed. Let me publish the pipeline. Click publish. This pipeline is successfully published. Let me run my pipeline and pass the parameter as employee1 folder. Let me click OK. Let me go to the pipeline run and click refresh. The forEach activity is called, and if you see, the employee1 folder has 2 files and 2 times the copy data activity is called. The pipeline runs successfully. Now let me go to the container. Let me go to the curated container. We see here that the subfolder files are successfully copied. With this, we have successfully created the child pipeline. The next step is to create the master pipeline and pass the subfolder name from the master pipeline to the child pipeline. Let's implement that. Let's create the master pipeline. For that, I'm going to the author and create a new pipeline. I'm going to name my master pipeline as PL master. Let me go to the manager folder. Here is our manager folder. First we need to read the folders and the files present in the manager folder. Let's do that. I'm going to add a get metadata activity. Inside the settings, I'm going to add a data set. The data is in Azure Blob Storage. Let me click binary and click continue. I'm going to name my data set as DS master. I can use the same linked service that we created previously because we are using the same storage account. Here I'm going to select the manager folder. Manager folder. Let me click OK and OK again. And in the field settings, I'm going to select the child items in order to read the files and the folder names. Let's publish the pipeline and run till this point. The pipeline is successfully published. Let me trigger my pipeline. Let me go to pipeline runs. And let's see the output of the get metadata activity. If you see here, inside the child items, we have all the folders names listed and the files listed here. We have to iterate over the files separately and the folders separately. In order to filter the files and the folders, I'm going to use toFilter activity. Let me do that. In my master pipeline, I'm going to add toFilter activity. One filter activity to read the file names and the other filter activity to read the folder names. Let me connect the get metadata activity to this filter activity. The first filter activity is to read the file names. I'm going to the settings. In the items, I'm going to select get metadata child items. And in the condition, I'm going to select dynamic contents. The item type should be a file and the file should end with .txt. Now let me click OK. For the first filter activity, similar to what we have in the child pipeline, let's add a forEach activity, and inside that we can have a copy activity to copy the files. Let's do that. I'm going to add a forEach activity and connect this output to the forEach activity. In the settings, I'm going to add filter activity output dot its value. Let me click OK. Inside the forEach activity, I'm going to have a copy data activity. Inside the copy data activity source settings, I can select the same data set that we used for the get metadata activity in the master pipeline, DS master. Let me use wildcard file path in order to iterate over the file names. The files are present in the manager folder. Inside that, I'm going to select the files returned by the forEach activity dot name inside the name key. Let me click OK. The source settings are completed. Now let me go to sync settings. I can select the same target dataset that I used in the child pipeline. We have completed the copy data activity settings. Let me go to the master pipeline. Let me select the next filter condition. In the settings, the item should be get metadata child items, and the condition should be the item type should be a folder. Now let me click OK. In order to iterate over the folders, I am going to use a forEach activity. Let me connect the output of this filter to this forEach activity. In the forEach activity settings, I am going to select the filter activity output value. Output dot value. Let me click OK. Inside the forEach activity, we are going to execute the child pipeline and pass the subfolder name as a parameter to the child pipeline. Let's implement that. Inside my forEach activity, I am going to add execute pipeline activity. In this execute pipeline activity settings, I am going to select the child pipeline. We got a prompt to enter the folder name. This folder name is coming from the forEach activity item dot name. Let me click OK. We have pretty much completed the master pipeline. Before we execute the master pipeline, let me clear the curated container. Let me delete these files. I have deleted all the files from the curated container. Now let's run the pipeline. Let me publish. Let me trigger my pipeline. Let me go to pipeline run. The pipeline is running successfully. Both the filter activities are called, one for the files and the other one for the folders. And the forEach activity is called 2 times to iterate over the files and folders separately. And the execute pipeline activity is called 3 times since we have 3 subfolders. Let me refresh. The pipeline runs successfully. Now let's go to the curated container and see if the files are copied. Let me refresh. We see that the files are successfully copied from the manager folder and the subfolders into the curated container. This is the approach of creating a nested pipeline in the Azure Data Factory and in the Synapse Analytics. I hope you like this video and I'm sure that you learned something new today. If you do like this video, please consider to subscribe and I will see you in yet another interesting Azure use case. Thank you.